This is Theory of Change. I'm Matthew Sheffield. Thanks for joining me for another episode. The Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs versus Jackson, ending a national right to terminate a pregnancy, came as an abrupt shock to millions of Americans. But if you had been paying attention beforehand, the verdict was no surprise at all. In fact, the end of Roe versus Wade was the culmination of a successful strategy that began in the 1970s to flood the United States court system with activist judges who would impose their radical religious and economic viewpoints on America. Viewpoints that were so radical, congressional Republicans didn't even dare to try to enact them legislatively. David Brock, David Brock, our guest in today's episode, lays out how this all happened in his new book, Stench, The Making of the Thomas Court and the Unmaking of America. As outrageous as the court's recent rulings have been, what is perhaps even more outrageous is that the right-wing takeover of the American judicial system took place almost entirely in full public view, as organizations like the Federalist Society and other deceptively named groups work together to launder extremist viewpoints and to disperse millions of dollars to everyone from law students to Supreme Court justices. Can anything be done about this dreadful situation? We discuss that as well. I hope you'll enjoy. And if you get a chance, please do share this episode on social media to help spread the word. Thanks a lot. And joining me now is David Brock. Welcome to Theory of Change, David.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so this is, I was saying before we recorded that it's a bit surreal for us to be talking because the old me and the old you would have never imagined talking to apostates, evil apostates from the right that we both ended up being. But your book that we're going to be talking about here today, like it is, I think, a really good illustration of how, the right uses politics the right uses institutions to change politics, whereas the left uses institutions to make change.
Mhm.
And and the right is so focused on doing that from an institutional level and a financial level. And I mean, your book just lays it all out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Beginning with a memo that Lewis Powell wrote before he went on the Supreme Court, laying out what they wanted to achieve, and then money moved, and you had a group like the Federalist Society, which was founded as basically by three conservative law students. That was founded as basically a debating society that over time became incredibly powerful validator for essentially you needed their imprimatur to get a federal judicial nomination, or in the George W. Bush administration, certainly any high level executive branch positions. And so they were able to do this by having a sort of public facade of the debating society, and then a kind of stealth operation where they were highly ideological, but people could appear before the Senate Judiciary Committee in a confirmation hearing and say that the Federal Society, they didn't even know it had an ideology, and so they could deny it and get away with it. And so this was a very persistent group of people that, from the outside, if you don't admire the results, you can admire the steadfastness and the focus and the money. Money was critical. Once Citizens United came down, the Federal Society coffers on the dark money side exploded. Leonard Leo, who runs the Federal Society, formed additional groups, adjunct, adjacent to the Federal Society, that took in tens of millions of dollars in dark money for these judicial campaigns. I calculated that in the last 10 years, the Federal Society and its affiliates spent $750 million on these campaigns. But when you look at it, I mean, that's a lot of money, but when you look at it, if you look at the benefit they've gotten, the not only on the social conservative side, but on the big business side, the decisions that have been favorable to corporate interests, which fund the Federal Society groups, that's got to be in the billions of dollars.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, these amounts that they put in were just down payments. That's really what they were. Um, and yeah, but I guess before we get too far into that, though, can we circle back though just to the Lewis Powell memo and who he was for people. So for people who are not aware of who he was and the critical role that he played in sort of cementing both disinformation as the Republican political strategy, and then also their interest in the courts.
Right. Yes. So he was a member of the Chamber of Commerce assigned essentially by the chamber to write a memo about how the Republican right could organize itself to fight what they saw as liberal dominance across the institutions of the country, which included universities, media, and the judiciary. Um, and so uh, Powell, basically put into writing that they needed a concerted effort over many years and devote many millions of dollars to uh, to thwarting this liberal threat. And it would be done by building institutions of their own that would uh, eventually uh, change the political uh, discussion in the country and to the favor of the right. And so this was the theory was you could fund think tanks, you could fund academic uh, institutions, scholarships, you could fund alternative media, and you could fund organizations uh, like the Federalist Society, which didn't exist at the time but came to exist to exert pressure on the judiciary and to put their own folks into the positions of power. And so this was a long-term plan. He warned that it was going to require years of work. Um, and shortly after writing the memo, he was appointed by Richard Nixon to the Supreme Court, where he was basically a pragmatic pro business conservative. But for my story and in my book, what matters is he was a trailblazer in loosening the campaign finance rules. And so uh, on the court, he was essentially able to, through their decisions, to enable a lot of money to flow into these uh, conservative outfits.
Hmm. Well, and you mentioned it only slightly, but he also, Powell was a lawyer for big tobacco, for tobacco companies. And,
Yes.
they were the originators of this idea of, so there's a debate between two sides here. We have to, and that the media have to cover these claims made by any side, um, even if there's no evidence for them. And I mean, the research for tobacco causing cancer that was, pretty definitive very early on, but it took decades to overcome this, this sort of both sides framework that had been built up by Powell, and sort of, in many ways, I think it was like a hack of the liberal epistemology. The idea of, there's that saying that sometimes attributed to Will Rogers, that a liberal is someone so broad-minded that he won't take his own side in an argument. And I think that that's what the both sides. It's a hack of that mindset. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And certainly this notion of false or phony balance that the right has successfully perpetrated has done an awful lot of damage to the discourse. But it's been a very effective tool for them to inject what essentially is conservative or right wing propaganda into the debate, where you've got 99% of scientific consensus on an issue and 1% funded by the coal industry, and then you've got them on cable television. You've got you've got a climate scientist, and then you've got uh, a right wing spokesperson, and they're presented as their arguments having equal weight. And that is consistent through a lot of different issues that the media deals with, and we're still dealing with that today.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, and with these institutions, though, it was an interesting. The Powell memo is interesting to see in retrospect because I think it does capture the right wing sensibility that that they are this sort of aggrieved minority or silent majority, depending on how they who's talking and who they're talking to. But they have this sense that everyone's out to get them, that nobody agrees with them, but their ideas are still true, even though they're not provable and not demonstrable. And so they create these institutions because they feel like their ideas are not taken seriously. And of course, the reason they're not taken seriously is that they're not very good ideas. And they're not, like if you want to say that, let's say that there's no genetic component to homosexuality, or that it's all Satan. Like, if you want to believe that, you're obviously free to,
Right.
but it's nonsense. And you're going to say the Earth is 6,000 years old, or that I mean, just any of these variety of things.
Right.
That was really what they're trying to do in many ways, and where the tax cuts increase revenue. Like, there's just, it's complete nonsense what they're saying. But to a large degree, I think that so they weren't wrong that societal neutral institutions were against them. But people on the left never adequately understood that if you've got people who have created this network dedicated to destroying institutions, maybe you should do something to save them, and to, or at least, get them to defend themselves.
Right. Yeah. No. That's. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think that what gets overlooked in this media effort to be fair to both sides is that there are some ideas that are valid and there are some that are not, and you get equal time for the ones that are not in this this paradigm that comes largely out of, if you look back on it, it was intentional effort really to the right used the argument of balance to get a foothold into the mainstream media. It's how they first got, for example,
Hmm.
right wing columnists published in mainstream publications, and then further to that, into the mainstream cable conversations. And so it was an effective argument, and it was obviously the first iteration of Fox was Fair and Balanced, which played on this notion. They've sort of shed that now, as more and more people, I think, have come to the conclusion that at least people who are not watching it, that it's right wing, Republican Party
Hmm.
propaganda.
Yeah, they've decided to embrace that, especially as they've faced more competition from the even further right, like pretending that you're centrist when you're just bleeding viewers to Newsmax or Right Side Broadcasting or any of these other ones. Like, that's not a good business proposition anymore.
Yeah, no, it's demonstrable that on there have been times now where you can definitely chart that Fox stakes out one position and Newsmax is further to the right, and then Fox changes its programming to be in concert with Newsmax so they don't lose rating share. Absolutely true.
Yeah, yeah, and obviously most prominently with the 2020 election, that they had originally stood by their accurate projection that Joe Biden was going to win Arizona.
Right.
And then and that the election wasn't stolen, that there was no evidence for it. They actually said that for some time, or at the very least, we're not promoting. Most of their people were not promoting these absurd things that Sean Hannity or some of the other ones were talking about. as the court record showed. Also, they didn't believe it. They didn't think it was real. And like but this whole idea of pushing this truth through power rather than knowledge. That's ultimately what I think this book and a lot of your other books are about. Is that if you don't have to be able to prove what you believe, as long as you can force society to be governed by it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very it's a very results oriented approach, and uh, it this is really one of the fundamental reasons why originally I broke with the right was um, not over an issue like supply side economics doesn't work. It was real more about the integrity of the work and the conversation and the complicity that I felt in my own for my own self being involved with what was basically even then what it took to succeed was lying, and that you did that for ratings and you did that for an audience. And of course, it's far worse today because of the internet. But yeah, no, I agree. I agree that they have no they have disregard for any sense of truth in what they're saying, and in fact, the opposite, that it gets rewarded.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's why Trump, I even now, 9 years after the guy came onto the scene, you're still seeing essays from, clueless liberals and centrists saying, "Gosh, I can't believe that these evangelicals and hardcore Christians like someone who's such a liar." And it's like, well, actually, the whole movement was built on lies long before Trump. Like he just does it better.
Yeah, there's still a really fairly large body of commentators and political observers in the middle and on the left who still haven't come to terms with Trump, and that's the group that can't believe that the election is as close as it is, because they just can't fathom that there's 48% or so of the country that is enthralled by Trump, or because of tribal loyalty, is just following along the Republican line. But yeah, and it's inhibited a response to Trump because a lack of understanding. I mean, understanding it is the first step toward trying to work against it. And so I think
Absolutely.
that some of the Never Trump groups are a little somewhat better at this. I think because they understand the right somewhat more than the mainstream or liberal commentators do. But yeah, there's definitely a deficit of the appreciation for how much uh, that how much groundwork was already laid and how much of a foundation there was already built for what Trump brought along and brought out in a certain segment of the electorate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and there's an essay from George Orwell where he talks about his fellow mid-century, or I guess early 20th century author H.G. Wells. Have you ever seen that? It's a really fascinating piece.
No,
I can send it to you. Yeah.
no, sure.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so basically, what H.G. Wells was a pacifist socialist, and he kept writing all these things saying, "Oh, well, Hitler is going to lose. No one likes him. He's he called him a quote screaming little defective in Berlin, and that everything was just going to collapse. He couldn't invade anyone, and of course that was completely wrong. And Orwell, he said, let me just pull it up here. He said the he said that his that Wells couldn't understand any of what was going on because he belonged to a different century. That these were creatures out of the dark age that have come marching into the present, and the people who have shown the best understanding of fascism are either those who have suffered under it or those who have a fascist streak in themselves.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And I think that's 100% right about an understanding Trump. That if your ideas are and your constitution is so totally different from him, you should listen to people who actually understand how it works and why it works.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I think agree with that as well. And that's why there's always some value in defectors.
Yeah. All right. Well, so just going back to the book here. So, all this got started during the Nixon years, of course, and one theme that you do develop also is kind of some of the religious aspects of this. And in a lot of reporting in media about right-wing religion tends to focus on evangelicals, but there's no question that it was far-right Catholics who have remade the Supreme Court in their own image rather than the evangelicals.
Yes, that's right. Leonard Leo, who I mentioned as the head of the Federalist Society for many years, is also a member of a extreme sect of the Catholic Church called Opus Dei, which basically preaches that you bring your religious beliefs into your daily professional life. And so, to an extent, for Leonard Leo, this is the abortion issue is a religious crusade. And what he was able to do was fuse the Catholic and the evangelical religious folks with the big business interests. And that's how basically you got both Roe overturned, but you got all these business-friendly decisions rendered by the High Court, and that was intentional, and it was a good for them anyway. It made sense and was a good strategy. The problem is that if we went down the 100% the path of Leonard Leo, we'd be in a theocracy, and so you see this in some of the jurisprudence, for example, of Gorsuch, where the right has invented this notion of religious liberty to fritter away separation of church and state, and to also on LGBT issues issue contrary rulings on the basis of this notion of religious liberty. And so you do see he's a lapsed Catholic, but the others are current in their faith. From
I'm sorry, you said who isn't a lapsed Catholic?
Gorsuch is a lapsed Catholic. He went to the same
Okay,
Catholic school as Kavanaugh, but I believe, he's not a Catholic at the moment. He converted.
I think he's Lutheran, if I
Yeah, something
remember,
like
or
that,
something like
right.
that.
So,
Um,
but there's definitely a
yeah,
strong religious. There are Opus Dei lieutenants of Leonard Leo working in these groups, and so there's definitely a theme that runs through it that is resisted, uh, you know, in discussions by the media and by Democrats. The whole theme is resisted on the basis of not wanting to be accused of religious bigotry, but the
mhm.
uh, the beliefs are there.
Yeah. Well, okay, so you mentioned that their peculiar view of religious liberty, but let's actually dig into that. What do you mean by that? It is a complete perversion of the traditional meaning of religious freedom. And it's important, I think, for people to understand that this is, now the dominant viewpoint on the right.
Yeah. So one of the things I show in the sort of history of the Federalist Society is that they are not just responsible for judges getting on the bench. That's just the tip of the iceberg. But there's a whole system, a kind of conveyor belt of each step of the way as you get to these decisions, the Federalist Society funding things, and so funding elements. So the first is funding scholars in universities who come up with various theories that are on the edge or outside the box, whatever you want to call them, unconventional right wing theories. And these ideological hothouses come up with the theories. And then the next step is that they fund plaintiffs to bring these cases. And so they find the plaintiffs, and they, through other right wing organizations, essentially get them money. And so that's a second step. And then the third step is what they call amicus briefs, friend of the court briefs, are briefs brought by organizations or entities that are not party to the lawsuits. But they're influential. The judges and the justices read them and taken them into account. Well, what ends up happening is in these cases, if you look at the people who are filing the friend of the court briefs, they're almost universally other organizations that receive money from the organized right, if not Leo directly, then other donors. And so so by the time you get to the justices, you have a fully baked process by which then you have a decision. And so to circle back, this religious freedom is one of the things that would have come out of one of these ideological attached to law schools, including some very prestigious law schools, and then becomes part of accepted theory by the supermajority on the court. And one case where they went out and found a plaintiff where this came into play was the baker who said that it was a violation of her religious beliefs to bake a cake for a gay wedding. Now, this was a plaintiff that was located, funded, who never was approached by anybody who was gay to make the cake. So it was basically a made-up suit. And then on the basis of this religious liberty theory, the justices upheld the position of the baker in a fairly major case in the last couple of years.
Yeah, well, and it's this idea that you can engage in any kind of discrimination or even flout any law, depending on like some of the more radical interpretations that laws are null and void if you say they're against your religious beliefs. And this is even Antonin Scalia, when he was alive, actually went against this idea. Like, this was too radical for him. There was the case where, if you remember, there was a Native American tribe that was suing to be able to use peyote in religious ceremonies, but peyote was a controlled substance, and according to Scalia, well, that didn't matter because the state had a greater interest in keeping peyote an illegal substance, and so therefore their religious freedom complaint was invalid. But now the right has completely turned that around on its head and said that, well, actually, some of these religious beliefs flout anything else. Everything else is less important than their religious opinions.
Right. Yeah. So right, and it becomes, as in the case that I cited earlier, it is what you said, essentially an excuse for discrimination, and so uh, that's the way they want it to come down, for sure.
Yeah. And one thing that was the crucible for all of this and really got it going in terms of letting, getting the right much more serious about funding a takeover of the judicial system was the failure of Robert Bork to get onto the Supreme Court after he was nominated by Ronald Reagan in 1987. And that's a moment that you spend quite a bit on. But for people who are younger, I think they may not have heard of that incident. So maybe let's go over that real quick and what were your takeaways or the rights takeaways were from that.
Yeah, definitely. It was a watershed moment in the history of the last certainly 40 years that I'm writing about. So Robert Bork was uh, one of the original faculty advisors to the Federalist Society, along with Antonin Scalia. And Robert Bork gave the first major speech to the Federalist Society uh, on its first conference. And the speech was about Roe v. Wade and the need to overturn it, and that it was an attack on abortion rights. And so from there, Robert Bork had a long paper trail of right wing decisions. And so, so he was appointed by Ronald Reagan. It was near the end of Reagan's term. It seemed as if um, Reagan, even though he wasn't standing for reelection, had his standing, uh, questioned with the Iran Contra scandal. So they wanted something to reinvigorate the base of the Republican Party and the conservative movement that would rally around Robert Bork. So they picked Bork. They knew that he had this paper trail, and so in a sense, they went into it knowing that it was going to be a tough fight that they might actually lose, and that Bork would be kind of a sacrificial lamb, which they were probably okay with. So the confirmation hearings went on. All of this record came out into the public domain. Um, Robert Bork stood with his views. He didn't, like subsequent nominees, try to evade the questions. He answered them directly, and the views were out of step with mainstream America. There was no question about that. And so um, there was an orchestrated liberal effort to defeat him. People for the American Way and other organizations that were very active back then, and civil rights organizations. There was a whole anti-Bork coalition that formed. And so the takeaway was for the right, that they were victimized by basically what they viewed as a smear campaign by the left. And even though I conclude in the book that the term Borking became very popular on the right as meaning a smear campaign. But what I conclude in the book is that Bork basically borked himself, and that there was no smear campaign. It was just an educational campaign. But the way they took it was very personally. Bork was absolutely, literally one of them. And so they swore to have this never happen again. And so the import of the Bork nomination really comes in later, starting with the Thomas nomination, where the nominees are coached by the White House and the Justice Department, Republicans, to basically deny their positions. And so all if you flash forward, all three of the Trump nominees, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett, all in slightly different ways misled the Senate Judiciary Committee as to their position on abortion and Roe v. Wade. And these were lessons that the right drew from the Bork nomination. You couldn't really be yourself. You couldn't be honest. You'd be coached to evade and obfuscate to skate through the nomination process.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And it was, in a lot of ways, a lesson that they had learned earlier in 1964 after Barry Goldwater got completely destroyed in the general election against Lyndon Johnson. That you know, they had an inkling that the general public did not agree with them, but it didn't matter because they were going to build institutions of power to voice their viewpoint on the public anyway. And and then another another sort of pillar of getting their nominees through, besides the Federalist Society, was also creating a lot of these astroturf organizations. Like the you mentioned one, the Independent Women's Law Center, which of course was said to be independent, but of course was funded entirely by Republicans. Um, and that, like, they have done that going forward ever since, like with all these phony organizations and with these neutral sounding names, like Americans for Consumer Protection, which conveniently always seems to want companies to make shoddy products and pollute, and like that became a core component as well after this, I think, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a whole network of organizations, some funded directly by Leonard Leo and others by other donors like the Koch brothers. And they are front groups, if you will. They are not honest about who they are, and uh, they're formed basically as uh, they're basically media focused groups that go out and uh, under this notion we were talking about earlier, balance, get get quoted. So you have the Independent Women's Forum out there adjacent to Women for Judge Thomas, and so they do create these organizations. Also, the Friend of the Court briefs. A lot of those organizations are similar in that they're you can't really tell what they are from their name.
Yeah, and we saw that most recently with the Moms for Liberty group, which was able to kind of flood into school boards across the country with this very innocuous sounding name, and get people to do what they wanted, despite them having no idea where they came from or who was funding them. Um, yeah, and then of course, after Bork failed to get onto the bench, then there was the nomination of David Souter, who ended up not being sufficiently vetted from their standards, and he, ended up not ruling in lockstep the way that they thought that he might have. Um, and so when the right got a chance to nominate again, they picked Clarence Thomas, and you call you call the current court the Thomas Court, even though he's not the judge of the Supreme Court. So let's maybe get to that point first, and then we'll go back to the confirmation and your own personal history there.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so absolutely, the Republican presidents appointed some justices who were disappointments to the right, Souter, Kennedy, O'Connor, and so the effort to overturn Roe, uh, which you can trace back pretty much to the time that Roe was decided, suffered several setbacks along the way. And it wasn't until Trump made a deal with the Federalist Society in the 2016 campaign that they were able to really achieve their goals. And that deal was evangelicals were skeptical somewhat of Trump because of Trump's personal behavior. And so the Federalist Society gave lists to Donald Trump, and he picked from those lists his justices, and this was publicly announced and known to voters at the time in 2016, and so that gave him the Good Housekeeping seal of approval. And then he did do what he said. He did pull all three from these lists, and then they did do what they were selected to do. Now, the reason I say that this is the Thomas Court is because in the deciding of Dobbs, John Roberts loses control of the court. It is the case that he did not favor overturning Roe. The case from Mississippi had a 15-week abortion ban. He was willing to uphold that ban, but not go all the way to reversing Roe. There was a campaign in the press, in editorial in the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which is a very well-known outlet for these right-wing judges. And basically, the editorial revealed that Kavanaugh and Barrett were shaky on overturning Roe, and they might side with Roberts. And so that purpose of that leak was to lock in their votes, because if they then did not overturn Roe, they'd look like they turned tail and they were weak and various other things that the right would say about them. So that's basically another aspect of the decision that raises questions about the whole legitimacy of the whole operation, that pressure campaign. But that's basically the Thomas Court. Obviously, nominally, Roberts is still in control, but he's proved to be a very weak justice, and particularly weak on the issue of having any kind of accountability for the justices. People probably know that there is no ethics regime that governs the Supreme Court. It's self-regulating. There are rules for every other level of federal judges, but none of them apply to the Supreme Court. And Roberts has done nothing but sit on and really, in their own report, where they adopted so-called some ethics reforms, it covers it all up. And I have one piece of information in the book where the Judicial Conference of the United States, which governs all the federal judiciary below the Supreme Court, was so upset about Thomas and the gifts that he was receiving and the fact that he didn't disclose them that they wanted to do something publicly about it, and Roberts shut it down.
Yeah. Well, and and yet though, I get the feeling that Democrats don't really talk about this outside of Sheldon Whitehouse. Kamala Harris almost never mentions the Supreme Court's radicalism, other than in the context of Roe versus Wade. Um, and like, whereas before the repeal of it, that was probably one of the most common talking points in a Republican presidential campaign, that we have to get the judges, and you don't have to like me, but there is a long-term future at stake here, so vote for me anyway, even if you don't like everything that I'm about. She doesn't really make that argument, and it's an odd thing to see.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, to say the least, the Democrats consistently have missed the boat on the issue of the Supreme Court. For years, the right was organizing through Federalist Society to capture the court. There was no response. Democrats, in some circumstances, enabled the right's campaign. For example, Joe Biden was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee during Anita Hill. He acted more as a judge than a senator, if you will, and allowed a deal to be made with the Republicans that only Anita Hill would testify and not other corroborating witnesses, which basically guaranteed that it was he said, she said, and that things would
Yeah.
get confirmed.
Because she was not the only woman who had accused him of
Right,
sexually, right?
right. There were women in the wings waiting to testify to similar behavior. And so, flash forward to right now, you've got Senator Durbin as the chair of the committee. As you mentioned, Senator Whitehouse, very outspoken on all this, has written his own books about it, has done a lot to educate the public on the funding mechanisms behind the Federalist Society. But he is chafing under the non leadership of Durbin, who doesn't want to take an aggressive posture toward on these issues like Thomas and the gifts, or Thomas and his lack of recusal, which we haven't discussed.
I mean, yeah, they haven't even had hearings about this. I mean, yeah, like
That's right.
I mean, what's the total amount of money that Thomas has had? Like, it's over
Oh,
$1 million,
it's
isn't it?
definitely over $1 million. Yeah, because there
Yeah,
was one trip that was a $500,000, and there was the RV that was worth 300,000. So yeah, you're well over $1 million. And you're right. There were no hearings, and I think the issue is very ripe for Kamala Harris, and I scratch my own head as to why they haven't made this an issue. Hillary Clinton warned in 2016 that there would be two or three uh, vacancies in the court under the next presidency, but nobody paid attention. It didn't get covered. And Democrats weren't galvanized around it. And even after the Dobbs decision leaked, uh, a lot of Democrats were not convinced that Roe was actually going to be overturned. And so it's all
yeah,
been, it's a lot of this has been mishandled.
absolutely. Yeah, and the reason that I think that it's been mishandled is what I call the cult of constitutional law, and it is primarily constitutional law professors who are responsible for why Democrats did not and still have not acted adequately in response, because they cultivated this idea over the decades that you know that there was a sort of a science of the law, and they had found it, and that if you just followed the law and you knew what you were talking about, you would come naturally to progressive social conclusions and supporting of expansion of the federal state, or programs or regulations. Like, you would just naturally understand that that's how it was, because this is real, this is reality, and we've found it, and we teach it to our students, and we all live in a wonderful happy valley with butterflies floating around and birds singing. And none of that was true. None of that was true, and they didn't understand that it was almost like this. To go back to H.G. Wells, like he wrote his novel The Time Machine, and in The Time Machine there was these post-human Eloi that lived in plenty and had all their problems in life solved. They were vegetarians. They never had any, were never hungry, ever were violent, and then meanwhile they were being preyed upon by another tribe of post-humans, the Morlocks, who ate them and had completely developed their own society, and it was totally unknown to them. And the Morlocks had, the Eloi had no idea what was going on, and they were just completely defenseless. That's what's happened to the left, I feel like, in the United States.
Yeah, not only did they not know what was happening in terms of the Federalist Society activities, but uh, the whole the big idea of the Federalist Society, originalism, was never countered by in a meaningful way by liberal scholars, judges, etc. And
And certainly not to the public either,
not to
for
the
that
public.
matter.
No public case has ever been made against this notion of interpreting the Constitution very rigidly as a document that is set in stone from the time it was written. and that all the cases
Yeah.
have to flow from that. So they didn't know, they didn't see that coming either.
They did not, and and they also couldn't understand that the originalism, as an idea, that the right wing didn't even believe that either. Because if they did believe that, then they would not have created this, Second Amendment uber alles interpretation of the law that oh, you can't have any laws restricting guns because of the militia, and of course the idea was meant of the Second Amendment, as the history shows. If you had an actual originalist position on the Second Amendment, you would be in favor of restrictions if states wanted to have them on their citizens' right to bear arms, because it's the state's decision, not the government.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, originalism is uh, really a
It's just a
theory that's an
tool.
excuse to get the results, political results you want, and it can be turned upside down and twisted any way you want to just do just that.
Yeah. Now, you personally saw a lot of this ideological and factual malleability in your own life, because that was around when you had begun your career as the nomination of Clarence Thomas to the court, and you wrote a book attacking Anita Hill called "The Real Anita Hill," and then you, I guess, in writing it, and then afterwards, you really got sort of invited into the inner sanctum of all this stuff, right?
Yes. So after the Thomas hearings concluded, the American Spectator magazine, which was had some profile then, and does not so much anymore. Still exists, I think, on the web. But in any case, there was a donor who wanted to, you know, go after Anita Hill and protect Thomas's reputation because he was going to be on the court for 40 years. And so I took that assignment, wrote an article that turned into a book. Along the way, while I was writing the book, the way I put it is it had a strong viewpoint that Thomas was innocent and Hill was lying. And it was sourced all by people who were on the Thomas side. And yet I still believed that what I was doing was telling the truth about the situation. And so later, when I got closer to these folks, um, they were more honest in their relationship with me and led me to conclude by various things that were said that they never believed their own friend and that he had said and done some of the things that Anita Hill, alleged, and that this was all just a uh, political game. And that shook my foundations because I didn't think I was playing a political game. I thought I was defending what was right. And
Or being a pawn
yes, right.
of other people's.
Exactly. And, I take full responsibility for what I did, but I was used and sold a bill of goods. Absolutely. No question about that. And so I was never really the same again after that, even though it took me some time to work my way out of the conservative world. But that affected the way I saw everything going forward, and it resulted in I got a contract to write a book about Hillary Clinton that would be was thought to be similar hatchet job that had been done by me on Anita Hill, and I went into that with a very different uh, set of eyes, and wrote something that was much more, if you want to say, fair and balanced. And that definitely accelerated my departure from the right because I was all the people who had praised me for the Anita Hill book all trashed the Hillary book because it wasn't in line with their ideology, and it was right before the '96 election. And uh, basically, what I describe is uh, a crisis of conscience and that, as I said, took some time to work itself through. But by the time Bill Clinton was being impeached in '98, I was fully against that. Knew about a lot of the anti-Clinton operations as well that I was involved in earlier in the '90s, and Hillary Clinton talked about the vast right-wing conspiracy. All that conspiracy really is a wrongful scheme, and I thought that was what had happened, and so that was, and I started to say so, and that was the last straw, if you will, of getting out of the conservative world.
Yeah. Well, and it was yet another example of how, yeah, as much as the right loves to talk about, oh, we want to have a debate, we want to have both sides of the issue heard. In fact, they don't conduct themselves at all in that manner. They don't have debates, they don't have discussions. The only moment in recent 40 years or so, I feel like, when there was any sort of debate on the Republican side was about Donald Trump in 2015 or so. And then after he won the nomination, everybody who had said that they were going to never support Donald Trump, well, they fell in line and threw aside all the principles that they claimed were eternal and unmalleable. Turns out it was just about power all along.
Right. Yeah. No. Absolutely. They don't. The One of the things that originally, when I became a conservative, turned me off of liberals and the left was just the intolerance that I saw on the left in some circumstances toward right and conservative and Republican views, and it ended up being somewhat the opposite. That there's no free conversation. It's a party line 100% in the Republican Party, and not only after 16, but then even perhaps more egregiously after January 6th. There was an opportunity for accountability for Trump, and that, pretty quickly went away when the Republicans all fell into line.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, okay, so I mean, this is a very serious problem with the court and also the lower federal courts. A lot of these completely unqualified people who are just political activists, such as the judge who dismissed Donald Trump's case, his document theft case, on the basis that, well, he had the right to do this because he was the president, except he wasn't the president. Like that's so such astonishing thing is that she's claiming he has rights to do things as the president when he was out of office. Biden was president.
Right.
So these are serious issues, and you do toward the end of the book talk about some ideas fixing the situation. Let's get into that.
Yes. So I think that there's at least increased awareness of the problems that are exist with the court. Public opinion polls show that they're really in the toilet in terms of approval ratings, and so there's an opportunity to do something about it. You can't really do anything about it unless you have substantial Democratic majorities in Congress, and or you get rid of the filibuster in the Senate. But some of the ideas that I discuss in the book and that are out there as possibilities are, we talked a little bit about ethics reform earlier. We could have an ethics regime imposed by Congress on the Supreme Court. Constitutionally, they have the power to do it. For example, there is a $50 limit for what you can spend, what you can give, or in kind, a $50 lunch or whatever it is, with any federal official except on the Supreme Court. So it seems to me, I mean, Thomas is so far in violation of that, it isn't even funny that you could impose something like that, and various other things that would constitute putting some teeth in the disclosure. Right now, the justices decide for themselves whether they're going to, recuse themselves. and that could change as well. You could have objective and independent sources and authorities looking at that. So that's the ethics bucket. One thing I want to note is that even without the ethics regime, there are already laws on the books that Thomas is violating right now. With the gifts, you have the 1978 Ethics in Government Act. There are also federal laws on recusal that he's violating, and so something could be done. And Senators Whitehouse and Wyden wrote a criminal referral on Thomas to the Justice Department in July. That is a route where you wouldn't have to have Congress do anything because he's already a criminal, and so. But that's in the hands of the Justice Department, and I don't have any expectation that Merrick Garland would take it up. But that's just a side note that there are some things right now that could be done. Other ideas are term limits to give to have obviously more frequent turnover and give presidents a set number of nominees, each one the same number. That would distribute more evenly the ideology of the court, seemingly. The other idea is to expand the size of the court. I think that has to be considered. I think that where the consensus would end up would be something more like term limits than increasing the size. But if you really wanted to solve the problem sooner rather than later, because the term limits wouldn't apply to the current court. So if you wanted to solve this problem sooner or later, you'd address the issue of the size of the court and get more true balance and representation there.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and I noticed you did not talk too much about counter institutions, though. Why was that?
Counter institutions, yeah. Well, so there are some. What's out there is the American Constitution Society, which was formed as a response to the Federalist Society, but in true liberal fashion, they actually are a debating society, which is what the Federalist Society presented themselves as, and that's about it. So it's not really a response to the Federalist Society. We talked about there being no response to originalism, and then there are some groups that are pursuing Supreme Court reform, and those are worthwhile. But the problem with the reform issue politically is it's just not that sexy. And so, if I were running Kamala Harris's campaign, I would have her bring up Clarence Thomas to kind of personify these issues and personalize it. But I don't think you probably would never see that. But I think it would move some folks.
Yeah, well, it certainly simplifies the issue. But on the institutional point, though, like these institutions that the Federalist Society and all these other ones that Leo and other people are involved in, I mean, they're very important as a way of building an ecosystem because I think the going back to this whole sort of institutions will figure things out themselves and things are this blasé attitude that a lot of people on the center left who are who lead the institutions or are the donors, that they don't understand that institutions don't protect themselves. They are designed to be, governmental institutions are designed to be neutral and apolitical. And, things like the American Bar Association or something like that, like those are not supposed to be political. And it's good to have some non-political institutions. But you can't, those things will not protect themselves against this full-scale ideological assault. And then also, if you don't make your own countervailing institutions, you're going to make it so that people have to leave the political affair or the political arena because they can't afford to stay in it.
Yeah.
Like that's what's happening to a lot of younger progressives in the country right now is they cannot afford to be political activists. They have to get out because there's nothing for them. Whereas if you're on the right, you can be paid to speak at any number of conferences. There's these think tank fellowships available to you, innumerable think tank fellowships. You can have multiple of them at the same time. Doesn't matter. You can get a job at any of these publications or TV channels. Like there's, and then at the same time they have talent bank organizations that explicitly recruit people and network them together and match them with employers. There's nothing like that on the left, and this is why the right wins elections as much as it can, despite having only 25% of the public agreeing.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's basically a cradle to graves jobs program if you're in the conservative movement. And they do supply all these opportunities for uh, getting experience and then advancing. There are nothing like the pipelines that the conservatives have
No.
on the liberal side at all. And it does disadvantage the Democrats politically.
Yeah, and even on the media side, like the Kamala Harris campaign has spent most of its money on TV ads, but a lot of the money that they've spent has benefited Rupert Murdoch or has benefited Sinclair Broadcast Group, which are, part of the right-wing media machine. And so, like, donors to Kamala Harris have funded right-wing media
Yeah.
without realizing it. It's pretty awful, frankly.
Yeah. Well, it's 20 something years ago when I started Media Matters, the progressive media watchdog group. I identified as the single most, prevailing problem this this media behemoth that the right was able to build over the years, and it's only gotten a lot bigger and a lot worse since I said that 20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I mean, do you see have any positive changes happened in the meantime on that front, other than the establishment of Media Matters
Yeah,
on
I
the
think
left for you?
so. I mean, I think that um, when I started Media Matters, there was really zero appreciation for what the right had been able to achieve. And it was like people were gobsmacked to learn about it. I think there's a higher
Mhm.
level of awareness. There may not be the level of response yet, but there's a higher level of awareness. I feel like the culture is somewhat more aggressive than, say, 20 years ago. I remember when Media Matters launched, that year was the year of the Swift boat veterans and the Kerry campaign being completely blindsided by it. And not only blindsided, but then not responding to it for weeks. And when there was incredible, blood all over the place on the floor. And so I think that at that level, tactically, Democrats are better than they had been. But they're still, we're still too nice.
Yeah. Well, I think that's definitely true. All right. Well, so for people who want to keep tabs on what you're up to on the internet, what is your advice for them?
Well, one could go to the Media Matters website, which is updated hourly. And it's a very good way of finding out what's going on, particularly in right wing media that folks are not consuming. But it's a good way of keeping tabs on. It's like we watch Fox, so you don't have to. And so I would direct people there. Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thanks for being here.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Okay. All right, so that is the program for today. I appreciate everybody joining us for the discussion, and you can always get more if you go to theoryofchange.show with the video, audio, and transcript of all the episodes. And my special thanks to everybody who is a paid subscribing member. We have options on Substack or on Patreon. Thank you very much for your support. You have complete unlimited access. And if you can't afford to subscribe with a All right, so that is the program for today. I appreciate everybody joining us for the conversation. And you can always get more if you go to theoryofchange.show. You can get the video, audio, and transcript of all the episodes. And if you are a paid subscribing member on Patreon or Substack, you get unlimited access. And thank you very much for your support. And if you can't afford to subscribe on a paid option right now, we do have free subscriptions as well. And if you can leave a review on Apple Podcast or on Spotify, that would be helpful. If you're watching on YouTube, please do click like and subscribe as well. Thanks very much. I'll see you next time.